Good evening, friends, and welcome back to History for Sleep. I'm here with you tonight from my cozy study, where the clock has just struck 9:30, and the gentle patter of autumn rain creates the perfect backdrop for our journey together. Tonight, we'll drift into the peculiar world of medieval law, where the strangest rules you could never imagine once governed daily life across Europe. Dim your lights now. If you haven't already, pull that soft blanket up to your chin and let your shoulders sink deep into your pillow. Take a slow, gentle breath with me. Tonight's stories will carry you through 5 of the most bizarre laws that medieval people actually lived by. Rules so strange they seem almost fictional, yet they shaped the lives of countless souls centuries ago. If this calm journey helps you unwind and guides you toward peaceful sleep, tap like and subscribe only if it feels right. No pressure at all. I'm simply grateful you've chosen to spend these quiet evening hours with me, exploring the fascinating oddities of our shared past. So, settle in, dear listener. Let the gentle hum of history wash over you as we travel back to a time when laws were as colorful and unexpected as the people who created them. Close your eyes and let's begin this soothing adventure together. Let me tell you about a law so wonderfully absurd that it makes our modern food regulations seem downright reasonable. Picture this. You're living in medieval England around the year 1266, and you've just finished brewing a fresh batch of ale in your modest thatched cottage. The barley has been carefully malted, the hops added just so, and the fermentation has proceeded beautifully over the past several days. You're proud of your work, ready to serve this golden liquid to your neighbors and perhaps earn a few precious coins for your family's sustenance. But wait, before a single drop can pass anyone's lips, you must submit to the most peculiar quality control process imaginable. Enter the ale conner, an official whose job title alone would make anyone in our modern world pause and wonder if they'd heard correctly. This wasn't just any casual taste tester, mind you. This was a sworn officer of the law, appointed by local authorities and tasked with one of the most important duties in medieval society, ensuring that ale met the community's standards. Now, you might imagine this involved careful sipping, thoughtful consideration of flavor profiles, or perhaps some primitive form of chemical analysis. But no, the medieval mind worked in far more creative ways. The ale corner would arrive at your humble brewery, wearing his finest leather breeches, and this detail, dear listener, is absolutely crucial to our story. These weren't just any leather breeches, but specially designated testing garments that had been worn for this exact purpose. Time and time again, the process itself was almost ritualistic in its strangeness. The ale corner would request a wooden stool, preferably one that had been well used and bore the smooth patina of countless sittings. You, as the brewer, would pour a generous portion of your fresh ale directly onto the seat of this stool, creating an amber puddle that would gleam in the flickering candlelight of your workshop. The ale corner would then, with great ceremony and the full weight of legal authority behind him, sit down directly in this puddle of your carefully crafted beverage, and there he would remain, sometimes for what felt like an eternity to you, the anxious brewer. Minutes would tick by, marked only by the gentle crackling of your hearth fire and perhaps the distant lowing of cattle in nearby fields. The ale corner would sit in contemplative silence, your liquid creation slowly seeping through his leather breeches, while you waited with bated breath for the verdict that would determine your economic fate, if we can call it science, was actually rooted in medieval understanding of fermentation and sugar content. You see, if your ale had been properly brewed and fully fermented, the sugars would have been converted to alcohol, leaving no sticky residue behind. When the ale conner finally rose from his seated position, his leather breeches should have separated cleanly from the wooden stool, with perhaps just a slightly damp patch to show for the experience. But if you had been careless with your brewing, if you had rushed the process or used inferior ingredients, traces of unfermented sugars would remain in your ale. These sugars, when combined with the natural tackiness they possessed, would create an adhesive quality that would cause the ale conner's leather breeches to stick firmly to the wooden stool. The poor man would rise, and the stool would come up with him, attached to his rear end like some sort of medieval practical joke. This sticky situation, quite literally, was considered absolute proof of substandard brewing. It meant your ale contained too much residual sugar, that your fermentation had been incomplete, and that your product was unfit for public consumption. The legal consequences were swift and often severe. You might face hefty fines, have your entire batch confiscated and destroyed, or even lose your brewing license altogether. In a time when ale was often safer to drink than water, this could mean economic ruin for you and your family. The beauty of this law, from a medieval perspective, was its simplicity and its democratically observable nature. Any villager could witness the test and immediately understand the results. There was no need for complex explanations or detailed chemical analysis that only educated elites could comprehend. Either the ale conner stood up cleanly, indicating good ale, or he rose with a wooden stool attached to his posterior, indicating bad ale. The visual was unmistakable, often comical, and definitely memorable. But imagine, for a moment, the pressure this placed on medieval brewers. Your reputation, your livelihood, and your family's welfare all hung in the balance of whether a government official's leather pants would stick to a wooden stool. The anxiety must have been nearly unbearable as you watched this strange ceremony unfold in your own workshop, knowing that years of experience and careful craftsmanship could be judged by what was essentially a medieval version of a sit-tan stick. The ale conners themselves were often respected members of the community, chosen for their integrity and their supposed ability to maintain the leather breeches in proper testing condition. They took their duties seriously, understanding that the quality of ale affected not just individual brewers, but the health and safety of entire communities. A bad batch of ale could sicken dozens of people. So their odd testing method, strange as it seems to us now, served a genuinely important public health function. Some male conners developed quite a reputation for their testing abilities. Stories would circulate about those who could detect the slightest imperfection, whose leather breeches were so finely calibrated to the task that they could distinguish between various grades of brewing quality. These men became almost legendary figures in their communities, their verdicts respected and rarely questioned. The ritual also created a unique social dynamic. Brewing was often a family trade, passed down through generations, and the ale conner's visit was both dreaded and anticipated. Children would peer around corners to watch the strange proceedings. Wives would nervously tidy the workshop beforehand, and neighbors might gather outside to await the results. The entire event became a community spectacle, a form of entertainment that broke the monotony of medieval daily life. Consider the seasonal variations this law must have created. In winter, when the ale conner arrived, wearing thick, heavy leather breeches designed to keep out the cold, the testing might have been even more dramatic. The contrast between the warm, freshly brewed ale and the cold leather would have created interesting dynamics in the sticking process. Summer testing, with thinner garments and warmer weather, might have produced different results entirely, leading to seasonal adjustments in brewing techniques. The law also influenced the design of medieval brewing equipment. Stools used for ale testing became specialized pieces of equipment, carefully maintained and regularly inspected to ensure they provided consistent testing surfaces. Some workshops kept multiple stools, rotating them to prevent wear patterns that might affect test results. The stools themselves became almost sacred objects, treated with a reverence that seems amusing now but was deadly serious then. As the years passed and brewing techniques improved, the ale conner system evolved as well. Some regions developed variations on the basic stick test, incorporating additional observations and measurements. But the fundamental principle remained the same. The quality of ale could be determined by whether an official's clothing would adhere to furniture after sitting in the product being tested. This peculiar law reminds us that medieval people, despite living in what we might consider primitive conditions, were deeply concerned with quality control and public safety. They may not have had modern laboratory equipment or chemical testing procedures, but they developed creative solutions that served their communities well. The fact that this law persisted for centuries suggests it was actually quite effective, despite its seemingly absurd methodology. Now, let your mind wander from those sticky ale testing situations to an equally fascinating aspect of medieval law, the regulation of clothing and fashion. In our modern world, we generally assume that what we wear is a matter of personal choice, limited perhaps by our budget, our taste, or occasionally by workplace dress codes. But in medieval Europe, what you wore was often dictated not by preference but by law, and breaking these laws could result in punishment as severe as any crime against person or property. Imagine living in 14th century England, where the sumptuary laws of 1363 governed not just what you could eat, but what you could wear, right down to the fabric, the colors, and even the specific cut of your garments. These weren't suggestions or social customs. These were actual laws, enforced by courts and backed by the full power of royal authority. Picture yourself as a successful merchant, having worked hard for years to build your trade in wool or spices, finally accumulating enough wealth to afford some of the finer things in life. You walk into a tailor's shop, your purse heavy with coins, ready to commission a beautiful new gown or doublet that reflects your newfound prosperity. But the tailor, instead of eagerly showing you his finest fabrics, instead pulls out a thick ledger filled with legal restrictions. He explains, in the patient tone of someone who has had this conversation countless times, that despite your wealth, the law strictly prohibits you from wearing certain materials, certain colors, and certain styles. Your social class, determined not by your bank account but by the circumstances of your birth, dictates exactly what you're allowed to drape across your body. The complexity of these laws was staggering in its detail. If you were born into the merchant class, for instance, you might be permitted to wear cloth worth up to 6 shillings per yard, but absolutely forbidden from wearing silk, velvet, or any fabric containing gold thread. The vibrant crimson dyes that created the rich reds so prized by nobility were completely off limits to you, no matter how much you were willing to pay for them. Even the length of your sleeves was regulated. Certain elongated styles that we might find elegant were reserved exclusively for the aristocracy. These restrictions weren't arbitrary whims of fashion-conscious rulers. They served a deeply important social function in medieval society, maintaining what was believed to be the natural order of things. The thinking went something like this: if a merchant could dress exactly like a noble, how would anyone know who deserved respect and deference? How would the social hierarchy remain stable if visual cues disappeared? The clothing laws were essentially a form of social identification system, ensuring that everyone's place in the grand scheme of society remained immediately visible to all. Consider the psychological impact this must have had on ambitious individuals. You might spend decades building a successful business, accumulating wealth that rivaled or even exceeded that of minor nobility. Yet you were forced to dress in a way that constantly reminded everyone, including yourself, of your supposedly inferior social position. The law wasn't just regulating fabric, it was regulating dreams, aspirations, and self-expression. The enforcement of these laws created an entire bureaucracy of fashion police. Special officials were appointed to patrol markets, festivals, and public gatherings, carefully observing what people wore and measuring it against their known social status. These inspectors became expert at identifying forbidden fabrics at a glance, spotting illegal color combinations, and detecting unauthorized decorative elements. They carried with them detailed charts and references, like medieval fashion enforcement manuals, ready to cite specific legal codes when making arrests. The punishments for violating these laws were surprisingly severe. A first offense might result in confiscation of the offending garment, leaving the violator to walk home in their underclothes. A humiliating experience that served as both punishment and public warning. Repeat offenders faced escalating penalties, heavy fines, public stocks, and even imprisonment. In some extreme cases, habitual fashion law violators could face banishment from their communities, essentially becoming social outcasts for the crime of wearing the wrong shade of blue or an unauthorized quantity of decorative buttons. Women faced particularly complex restrictions that extended beyond mere fabric choices into the realm of accessories and personal adornment. A merchant's wife might be forbidden from wearing more than a single ring, regardless of her husband's wealth or her own family background. The number of brooches, the size of headdresses, even the type of fur used for trim were all subject to detailed legal regulation. Some laws specified that certain hairstyles were reserved for specific social classes, creating situations where your barber or hairdresser needed to be well versed in legal precedents before arranging your locks. The irony of these laws becomes apparent when you consider that they were often created by the very nobles who had the most to gain from relaxing them. Many aristocrats were deeply in debt, their inherited lands providing more prestige than actual income. They might have benefited enormously from selling their valuable clothing to wealthy merchants, or from relaxing restrictions that would have allowed a broader market for luxury goods. Yet, the psychological and social importance of maintaining visible class distinctions overrode these economic incentives. Regional variations in these laws created additional complexity for anyone who traveled. A fabric that was perfectly legal for your social class in one English county might be completely forbidden in the neighboring region. Merchants who conducted business across multiple territories needed to maintain different wardrobes for different locations, or risk legal trouble simply for crossing an invisible boundary while wearing the same clothes they had worn legally the day before. The laws also created fascinating black markets and underground economies. Skilled tailors developed techniques for creating clothing that appeared to comply with regulations while actually incorporating forbidden elements in subtle ways. They might use legal fabrics, but cut them in styles that suggested higher quality materials, or employ dyeing techniques that created colors very close to, but not exactly matching, the forbidden shades. These Guerreria garments allowed ambitious merchants and craftsmen to push the boundaries of the law without technically breaking it. Some of the most entertaining violations involved what we might call fashion fraud, people borrowing or renting clothing appropriate to higher social classes for special occasions. A merchant might borrow a nobleman's doublet for his daughter's wedding, or a craftsman might rent an elaborate gown for his wife to wear to an important guild celebration. These temporary elevation schemes required careful planning and often involved entire communities in maintaining the deception, at least for the duration of the event. The seasonal nature of medieval fashion laws created additional complications. Certain fabrics and colors that were forbidden during regular times of the year might be temporarily permitted during specific religious festivals or royal celebrations. This created opportunities for people to legitimately wear their finest illegal garments for brief periods, leading to a kind of seasonal fashion rebellion where communities would collectively dress above their station for a few sanctioned days each year. Children born into families that had recently gained wealth faced particularly poignant situations under these laws. They might grow up in households with sufficient resources to afford fine clothing, yet be legally prohibited from wearing garments that reflected their family's actual economic status. This created generational tensions, with young people chafing against restrictions that seemed increasingly arbitrary as their families' fortunes improved but their legal status remained unchanged. The psychological effects of these constant clothing restrictions must have been profound. Every morning, as people dressed for the day, they were reminded of their place in society's hierarchy. The simple act of choosing what to wear became a daily affirmation of social position, whether high or low. For those ambitious merchants and craftsmen who chafed against these restrictions, getting dressed each day must have felt like putting on a costume that never quite fit their sense of themselves. As we drift deeper into the peculiar world of medieval legislation, let me share with you perhaps the most chilling law of all, one that turned the simple act of sharing a meal into a potential death sentence. Picture yourself living in medieval Germany around the year 1430, where the concept of hospitality carried legal implications that would seem absolutely terrifying to us today. This wasn't just about proper etiquette or social niceties. This was about survival itself. Imagine you're a traveling merchant, having journeyed for days along muddy, treacherous roads with your small cart of goods. Evening approaches, and the autumn air carries that sharp bite that warns of the coming winter. You spot a small village ahead, its warm windows glowing like beacons of hope in the gathering darkness. Your horse is weary, your own stomach rumbles with hunger, and you desperately need shelter for the night. Following the customs you've known all your life, you approach the most prosperous-looking house in the village and request hospitality from its owner, the man who answers. Your knock seems pleasant enough. With kind eyes and a welcoming smile, he invites you in from the cold, offers you a place by his hearth, and begins preparing what appears to be a generous meal. The warmth of the fire feels wonderful against your travel-chilled bones, and the aroma of cooking food makes your mouth water with anticipation. You settle in gratefully, perhaps sharing news from the road, discussing the price of grain in the last town you visited, or simply enjoying the comfortable silence that comes with being safely indoors on a cold night. But here's where our story takes its dark turn. Unknown to you, this seemingly charitable host is operating under a law so bizarre and terrifying that it defies modern comprehension. According to certain medieval German legal codes, if someone offered you hospitality if they invited you into their home, shared their food with you, and provided you with shelter, they acquired a very specific and deadly legal right. For the next 3 days, after extending this hospitality, your host was legally permitted to kill you without facing any criminal charges whatsoever. Let that sink in for a moment as you imagine yourself in that warm, fire-lit room. The man ladling stew into your bowl, the woman bringing you fresh bread, the children perhaps peeking shyly at you from the staircase. Any of them could legally end your life at any moment during the next 72 hours. And the law would consider it perfectly acceptable. The same hospitality that had saved you from a cold, dangerous night on the road had simultaneously placed you in mortal peril. The reasoning behind this law reveals the complex and often brutal nature of medieval justice systems. The legislation was designed to address a specific problem that plagued medieval communities: how to deal with potentially dangerous strangers while still maintaining the Christian duty of hospitality. Medieval villages were small, tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone else. The arrival of a stranger represented both an opportunity, perhaps, for trade, news, or fresh perspectives, and a significant risk. Consider the vulnerability of these medieval communities. There were no police forces as we understand them today, no background check systems, no way to verify the identity or intentions of traveling strangers. A person who appeared to be a harmless merchant might actually be a spy, a thief casing the village for later robbery, or even a murderer fleeing from justice in another region. The 3-day hospitality law provided a legal framework that allowed communities to extend Christian charity while protecting themselves from potential threats. The 3-day timeline wasn't arbitrary. Medieval legal scholars and community leaders had observed that most travelers' true intentions became apparent within this time frame. A genuine merchant would conduct his business and move on. A pilgrim would rest briefly and continue his spiritual journey. But someone with criminal intent might use those first few days to gather information about the village's wealth, defenses, and vulnerabilities. The law essentially provided a trial period during which hosts could observe their guests and take lethal action if they detected any threatening behavior. From the guest's perspective, this law created an atmosphere of almost unbearable tension. Every interaction with your hosts carried potentially deadly implications. If you admired their silver too openly, might they interpret this as criminal intent? If you asked questions about the village layout, were you gathering information for nefarious purposes or simply making polite conversation? Even innocent behaviors could be misinterpreted by nervous hosts who held your life in their hands. The psychological dynamics this law created must have been fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. Hosts found themselves in the position of judge, jury, and potential executioner, forced to make life and death decisions about people they barely knew. The weight of this responsibility must have been enormous. How do you distinguish between suspicious behavior and mere nervousness, between criminal intent and cultural differences? The law placed ordinary villagers in positions requiring the wisdom of Solomon and the nerves of professional soldiers. Some communities developed elaborate protocols around this 3-day hospitality period. Guests might be assigned specific sleeping areas that could be easily monitored. Certain activities might be forbidden. Perhaps guests weren't allowed to wander the village alone, or to enter certain buildings, or to speak privately with local residents. These restrictions served both to protect the community and to provide clear behavioral guidelines for visitors who were aware of the law's existence. The social rituals that evolved around this law were complex and nuanced. Experienced travelers learned to navigate the 3-day period with extreme care, understanding that their survival depended on maintaining perfect behavior and avoiding any actions that might be construed as threatening. They might bring small gifts for their hosts, not just out of gratitude, but as a form of insurance. It's harder to kill someone who has just presented. Your children with exotic sweets, or your wife with fine fabric. Women travelers faced particular challenges under this law. Medieval society already viewed unaccompanied women with suspicion, and a woman traveling alone might be assumed to be fleeing some crime or scandal. Female guests had to navigate not only the general suspicions that surrounded all strangers, but also the specific prejudices and fears associated with their gender. Some might disguise themselves as men, while others might seek the protection of religious institutions rather than risk private hospitality. The law also created interesting economic dynamics. Some unscrupulous hosts might use the 3-day rule as a form of legalized robbery, killing wealthy guests and claiming their goods. However, this was balanced by the fact that hospitality was often reciprocal. Hosts who developed a reputation for murdering guests would find themselves unwelcome when they traveled to other communities. The medieval world was smaller and more interconnected than we sometimes imagine, and reputations traveled along the same roads as merchants and pilgrims. Religious authorities struggled with this law, as it seemed to conflict with fundamental Christian principles of charity and protection of travelers. Some church leaders argued that the law was incompatible with Christ's teachings about welcoming strangers and caring for those in need. Others contended that it was a necessary evil, a practical compromise between Christian duty and communal safety. This theological debate added another layer of complexity to an already morally ambiguous situation. The 3-day hospitality law also influenced the development of other medieval institutions. The growth of monasteries and religious houses that offered sanctuary to travelers was partly a response to the dangers inherent in private hospitality. These religious institutions could provide shelter without the deadly legal implications that accompanied staying in private homes. Similarly, the emergence of official inns and taverns was partly driven by the need for alternatives to the dangerous 3-day hospitality system. Record-keeping became important in communities where this law was enforced. Village leaders might maintain logs of visiting strangers, noting their arrival dates, intended destinations, and behavior during their stay. These records served both legal and practical purposes. They could be used to justify actions taken against threatening guests, and they helped communities track patterns of suspicious activity that might indicate organized criminal operations. The enforcement of this law required careful documentation and witness testimony. Simply claiming that a guest had behaved threateningly wasn't sufficient. Hosts needed to provide specific evidence of criminal intent or dangerous behavior. This led to the development of detailed legal procedures for evaluating claims of justified hospitality killings, creating a body of case law that helped define what constituted acceptable grounds for lethal action. As you lie there tonight, drifting towards sleep, imagine the courage it must have taken for medieval travelers to knock on strangers' doors, knowing that their request for shelter might be granting their hosts the legal right to kill them. Yet they did so, night after night, because the alternatives, sleeping rough in dangerous wilderness, facing bandits and wild animals, were often even more deadly than the 3-day hospitality law. It was a world where survival required constant vigilance and the ability to judge character quickly and accurately, where a warm meal and a soft bed came with risks that would paralyze most modern travelers. Let me guide your thoughts now to one of the most personally intrusive laws in medieval history. Regulations that reached right up to a man's face and dictated what he could and could not do with his own facial hair. In our modern world, we might debate dress codes or grooming standards in workplaces, but these pale in comparison to the sweeping beard laws that governed medieval European societies, particularly in England during the Norman period and beyond. Picture yourself as a Saxon man living in England around 1070, just a few years after the Norman conquest. Your entire world has been turned upside down by foreign invaders who speak a different language, follow different customs, and have imposed their own legal system upon your homeland. You wake each morning in a country that no longer feels like your own, surrounded by new rulers who view your traditions with suspicion and contempt. And now, as if the political and cultural upheaval weren't enough, these Norman overlords have begun to regulate something so personal, so fundamentally connected to your identity as a man, that it feels like an assault on your very soul. Your beard. For Saxon men, beards weren't merely a matter of grooming or fashion. They were symbols of masculinity, wisdom, and social status that connected them to their ancestors and their gods. A full, well-maintained beard marked a man as mature, responsible, and worthy of respect. The longer and more magnificent the beard, the greater the man's perceived wisdom and authority. Fathers would teach their sons the art of beard cultivation, passing down techniques for achieving the perfect length, thickness, and style that would serve them well throughout their adult lives. But the Norman conquerors brought with them very different ideas about masculine appearance. Norman fashion favored clean-shaven faces, or, at most, carefully trimmed mustaches. They viewed the Saxon love of full beards as barbaric, uncivilized, and potentially threatening to the new social order they were trying to establish. What better way to symbolically emasculate a conquered people than to strip them of one of their most cherished symbols of manhood? The laws that emerged from this cultural clash were breathtaking in their scope and invasiveness. Certain regions implemented complete bans on beards for men below specific social ranks. If you were a common farmer, a craftsman, or a merchant, you might be legally required to shave your face completely clean every few days, maintaining the smooth-cheeked appearance that Norman authorities deemed appropriate for your station. The penalties for non-compliance were severe enough to ensure widespread obedience. Heavy fines that could impoverish a family, public humiliation in the town square, and, in extreme cases, forcible shaving that often left men scarred and bleeding. Imagine the daily indignity of this situation. Each morning, as you prepared for the day's work, you would be forced to scrape away the facial hair that nature had provided, using primitive razors that were often dull, rusty, and dangerous. Medieval shaving was nothing like the convenient, relatively safe process we know today. Your tools might consist of a sharp knife, a piece of polished metal that served as a mirror, and perhaps some animal fat or soap if you were fortunate. The process was time-consuming, painful, and frequently resulted in cuts, infections, and permanent scarring. The psychological impact of these beard laws cannot be overstated. For men who had grown up believing that their facial hair was a mark of divine masculinity, being forced to shave felt like a daily act of spiritual self-mutilation. Some men reported feeling naked and vulnerable without their beards, as if they had been stripped of their adult identity and reduced to the status of beardless boys. Others described a sense of shame so profound that they avoided public appearances whenever possible, preferring to conduct their business from the shadows rather than display their legally mandated bare faces to the world. The enforcement of beard laws required a level of surveillance that seems almost comical to modern sensibilities. Special officials were appointed to patrol communities, examining men's faces and measuring the length of any facial hair they discovered. These beard inspectors carried with them standardized measuring devices, sometimes special combs or rulers that could determine whether a man's whiskers exceeded the legal limit. The job attracted a particular type of personality. Men who seemed to relish the power that came with humiliating their neighbors and fellow citizens. Some regions developed incredibly complex systems of beard regulation that varied based on profession, social class, and even the time of year. A blacksmith might be permitted slightly longer facial hair than a baker, supposedly because the heat of his forge made frequent shaving more difficult. Seasonal workers might receive temporary exemptions during harvest time, when long days in the fields left little time for daily grooming. Religious holidays might bring brief respites from beard enforcement, allowing men to experience a few days of natural masculine appearance before returning to their legally mandated baldness. The creativity that men employed to circumvent these laws was remarkable and sometimes desperate. Some developed techniques for creating the illusion of clean-shaven faces while actually maintaining very short, barely visible beards. They might use charcoal or other darkening agents to make their shaved skin appear naturally dark, disguising the shadow of facial hair beneath. Others experimented with different shaving patterns, removing hair from the most visible areas of their faces while allowing it to grow in spots that were less likely to be noticed by casual observers. Underground beard cultivation became a form of quiet rebellion against Norman authority. Men would grow their facial hair in secret, perhaps hiding it under scarves or hoods during public appearances, then revealing their magnificent beards only in private gatherings of trusted friends and family members. These clandestine beard exhibitions became symbols of resistance, reminders that Saxon identity and tradition survived. Despite legal oppression, the economic implications of beard laws were substantial and far-reaching. Professional barbers found themselves in positions of enormous power and responsibility, as they were often the only people legally authorized to help men comply with facial hair regulations. The demand for their services skyrocketed, allowing them to charge premium prices for what had previously been occasional voluntary grooming. Some barbers became wealthy and influential members of their communities, their shops serving as unofficial enforcement centers for beard laws. The development of shaving technology accelerated rapidly during periods of strict beard regulation. Innovative craftsmen worked to create sharper, more durable razors that could make the daily ordeal of shaving slightly more bearable. New types of soaps and oils were developed to reduce the pain and irritation associated with frequent hair removal. Some regions even imported exotic shaving aids from distant lands, creating international trade networks centered around the simple goal of helping men remove their facial hair more efficiently. Women found themselves caught in the middle of these beard controversies in unexpected ways. Wives and daughters were sometimes required to report violations of beard laws committed by the men in their families. This created terrible conflicts of loyalty, forcing women to choose between protecting their loved ones and obeying legal authorities. Some women became experts at helping their husbands and sons maintain the appearance of compliance, while actually circumventing the regulations through clever grooming techniques and strategic use of cosmetics. The religious implications of beard laws created additional layers of conflict and confusion. Many Christian theologians argued that God had given men the ability to grow facial hair for divine purposes, and that laws requiring the removal of this hair were essentially blasphemous. They pointed to biblical figures like Moses and Jesus, who were traditionally depicted with full beards, as evidence that facial hair was not only acceptable but actually holy. This theological opposition to beard laws created splits within religious communities and added moral complexity to what might otherwise have been seen as simple matters of civil obedience. Medical knowledge of the time suggested that beards served important health functions, protecting men's faces from cold weather, filtering dust and other airborne particles, and maintaining the natural balance of facial skin. Physicians argued that forced shaving could lead to increased illness, particularly during winter months when bare faces were more vulnerable to frostbite and respiratory infections. These medical arguments provided additional ammunition for those who opposed beard regulations on practical rather than cultural grounds. The international implications of beard laws sometimes created diplomatic complications. When men from regions with different facial hair regulations traveled to conduct business or negotiate treaties, their appearance could cause offense or confusion. A bearded Saxon merchant might find himself unable to conduct business in Norman territories, not because of any criminal behavior, but simply because his facial hair violated local grooming laws. Similarly, clean-shaven Norman officials might be viewed with suspicion and contempt in regions where beards were still legally required or culturally expected. As you settle deeper into your pillow tonight, consider the profound psychological courage it must have taken for medieval men to wake each morning and voluntarily mutilate their own appearance in service of laws they despised. Yet they did so, day after day, year after year, because the alternative open defiance of legal authority could mean imprisonment, exile, or death. Their daily acts of compliance were simultaneously acts of survival and surrender, small personal tragedies that occur. Now, let your mind drift to what might be the most delightfully absurd intersection of religious law and practical necessity in medieval history. Picture yourself living in a small English village during the 13th century, where the rhythm of life follows the strict patterns dictated by Christian observance. The Sabbath laws of this period weren't mere suggestions about appropriate Sunday behavior, they were comprehensive legal codes that regulated virtually every aspect of human activity from sunset on Saturday until sunset on Sunday. Imagine waking up on a Sunday morning in your modest cottage, the late autumn sun streaming through your single small window, casting geometric patterns across the packed earth floor. Your stomach rumbles with hunger, as it often does, but this particular hunger carries with it a complex web of legal and theological implications that would seem almost comical to modern sensibilities. You own a small flock of chickens, perhaps 6 or 7 hens, and a proud rooster who serves as both protector and timekeeper for your household. These birds represent a significant portion of your worldly wealth, and their eggs provide crucial protein for your family's survival. But here's where medieval law revealed its most peculiar character. While you were absolutely forbidden from working on the Sabbath, your chickens remained blissfully unaware of Christian theology and continued to lay eggs according to their natural biological rhythms. The question that tormented medieval legal scholars and village priests was this: if a chicken laid an egg on Sunday, was that egg the product of forbidden Sabbath labor? Or was it simply a natural occurrence that happened to coincide with the day of rest? The debates that raged around this seemingly simple question revealed the extraordinary complexity of medieval religious thought and its intersection with daily survival. One school of theological opinion held that since God had created chickens to lay eggs as part of their natural function, Sunday egg-laying was simply the continuation of divine design, and therefore perfectly acceptable. These scholars argued that prohibiting the consumption of Sunday eggs would be tantamount to rejecting God's natural bounty, a form of ungrateful asceticism that bordered on heresy. But opposing theologians presented equally compelling arguments. They contended that eating eggs laid on Sunday violated the spirit of Sabbath observance by benefiting from labor, even if that labor was performed by an animal rather than a human. In their view, the consumption of Sunday eggs represented a loophole that undermined the fundamental principle of Sabbath rest. If Christians could benefit from Sunday egg production, what would prevent them from finding other creative ways to circumvent Sabbath restrictions? The practical implications of this theological debate were enormous for medieval families who depended on their chickens for sustenance. During winter months, when other sources of protein were scarce or non-existent, eggs might represent the difference between adequate nutrition and slow starvation. A family that owned only a few chickens couldn't afford to waste even a single egg. Yet the legal uncertainty surrounding Sunday eggs created genuine moral dilemmas for conscientious Christians. Some communities developed elaborate systems for dealing with Sunday eggs that reveal the creative lengths to which medieval people would go to reconcile religious law with practical necessity. In certain villages, families would carefully mark eggs that were laid on Sunday, setting them aside in special containers until Monday morning. These eggs could then be consumed on weekdays without violating Sabbath restrictions. Though this system required careful record-keeping and created the risk of confusion about which eggs were acceptable and which were forbidden, other communities adopted even more complex approaches to the Sunday egg dilemma. Some villages appointed special officials whose job was to monitor chicken coops during Sabbath hours, documenting exactly when eggs were laid and ensuring that Sunday eggs were properly identified and handled according to local religious requirements. These chicken wardens, as they might be called, found themselves in the peculiar position of serving as timekeepers for poultry, their authority extending into the most intimate details of barnyard biology. The seasonal variations in egg production added additional layers of complexity to Sunday egg laws. During winter months, when chickens laid fewer eggs overall, the loss of Sunday production represented a more significant hardship than during spring and summer periods of abundant laying. Some regions developed seasonal exceptions to Sunday egg restrictions, allowing winter consumption while maintaining stricter standards during times of plenty. These variable approaches required careful calendar calculations and created opportunities for confusion and disputes about when different rules applied. The enforcement of Sunday egg laws created unique challenges for medieval legal systems. How do you prove that an egg was laid on Sunday rather than Saturday evening or Monday morning? Chickens don't announce their laying schedules, and determining the exact timing of egg production requires either constant surveillance or reliance on the honesty of chicken owners. Some communities developed religious oaths that chicken owners were required to take, swearing before God and their neighbors that they would accurately report the timing of all egg production in their co-ops. The theological implications of these laws extended far beyond simple questions about Sunday observance. Medieval scholars debated whether animals possessed souls, whether they could commit sin, and whether their actions could affect the spiritual status of their human owners. If a chicken laid an egg on Sunday, was the chicken violating Sabbath law? Could an animal be held spiritually responsible for actions that might endanger its owner's salvation? These questions might seem absurd to modern readers, but they represented serious theological inquiries that occupied some of the finest medieval minds. The economic aspects of Sunday egg restrictions created interesting market dynamics in medieval communities. Professional egg dealers had to navigate complex regulations about when eggs could be sold and consumed, developing expertise in religious law that rivaled that of local priests. Some merchants specialized in weekday eggs, guaranteeing customers that their products had been laid on legally acceptable days. This religious certification process added value to certain eggs while creating suspicious attitudes, others that couldn't be properly authenticated. International variations in Sunday egg laws created complications for travelers and merchants who conducted business across different regions. Eggs that were perfectly legal in one village might be considered religiously contaminated in the next community over. Traveling merchants had to become experts in local religious customs, understanding not just the products they sold, but the complex legal and theological frameworks that governed their consumption. Some of the most creative theological solutions to the Sunday egg problem involved timing manipulations that would make modern lawyers proud. Certain scholars argued that since the Sabbath was measured from sunset to sunset rather than midnight to midnight, eggs laid on Sunday morning before dawn were actually produced during Saturday night and therefore acceptable for consumption. This interpretation required precise timekeeping capabilities that most medieval communities lacked, but it provided a theoretical framework for reducing the impact of Sunday egg restrictions. The psychological effects of these laws on medieval families must have been considerable. Parents found themselves in the position of teaching their children to view their own chickens with suspicion, to question the spiritual acceptability of food that might be essential for survival. Children learned to associate their family's animals with complex moral and legal calculations, understanding that something as simple as breakfast could become a matter of religious law and community judgment. Women, who typically managed household poultry and egg collection, bore the brunt of responsibility for compliance with Sunday egg laws. They had to develop systems for monitoring their chickens' behavior, tracking egg production, timing, and ensuring that their families didn't inadvertently consume forbidden Sunday eggs. This added another layer of complexity to already demanding household management responsibilities, requiring skills that combined animal husbandry, religious knowledge, and legal compliance. The documentation requirements associated with Sunday egg laws led to the development of detailed record-keeping systems that reveal fascinating insights into medieval daily life. Some households maintained chicken diaries, carefully noting the laying schedules of individual hens and tracking patterns of egg production throughout the week. These records served legal purposes, but also provided valuable information about animal behavior, seasonal variations, and the practical challenges of managing small-scale livestock operations. The resolution of disputes about Sunday eggs often fell to local religious authorities, who found themselves serving as judges in cases that required both theological expertise and practical wisdom. Priests and monks became experts in poultry behavior, developing the ability to assess claims about egg-laying timing and make binding decisions about the religious acceptability of specific eggs. This judicial role extended clerical authority into the most mundane aspects of daily life, creating additional opportunities for religious oversight of secular activities. As our gentle journey through medieval legal oddities draws to a close, let me share with you perhaps the most deliciously ironic law of all, one that reveals the eternal human struggle between profit and honesty, between commerce and community trust. Close your eyes and transport yourself to medieval France around the year 1350, where wine wasn't merely a beverage, but a cornerstone of daily life, economic prosperity, and social identity. Picture yourself as a wine merchant in the prosperous city of Bordeaux, where the golden autumn sunlight filters through your shop windows, illuminating rows of wooden casks filled with the liquid treasure that has made your region famous throughout Europe. The harvest has been exceptional this year, and your cellars hold wine of such quality that it seems almost sinful to disturb it with commerce. Yet commerce is your livelihood, and the merchant ships waiting in the harbor represent connections to markets in England, the Low Countries, and beyond. But here's where our story becomes fascinatingly complex. Medieval wine law included regulations so specific and so severely enforced that they make modern consumer protection legislation seem almost casual by comparison. The authorities were particularly concerned with one practice that threatened the very foundation of the wine trade: the dilution of wine with water to increase volume and profits. Now, you might think that adding water to wine would be a relatively minor offense, perhaps warranting a fine or a stern warning from local officials. But medieval legislators understood that wine adulteration struck at the heart of community trust and commercial integrity. Their response was swift, creative, and memorably harsh. Anyone caught watering down wine for sale would be forced to drink nothing but water for an entire year. Imagine the exquisite torture this punishment represented in a society where wine was safer to drink than most available water sources, where wine accompanied every meal, celebrated every occasion, and provided comfort during life's difficult moments. For a wine merchant, someone whose entire professional identity was built around the appreciation and sale of quality wine, being condemned to a year of water consumption was tantamount to professional and social death. The enforcement of this law required investigation techniques that would have impressed modern forensic scientists. Wine inspectors developed sophisticated methods for detecting dilution, using specialized instruments to measure the density, color, and clarity of suspicious wines. They became expert at identifying the subtle changes in appearance, aroma, and taste that indicated the presence of added water. Some inspectors could allegedly detect dilution levels as low as 5%, a sensitivity that required years of training and constant practice. The testing procedures themselves became elaborate public spectacles that served both legal and educational purposes. When a wine merchant fell under suspicion, the entire community might gather to witness the official inspection. The suspected wine would be poured into special measuring vessels, examined under bright candlelight, and subjected to careful tasting by certified experts. These wine trials became forms of community entertainment, providing dramatic tension as merchants' reputations and livelihoods hung in the balance of official judgment. Consider the psychological pressure this law placed on wine merchants, who found themselves caught between economic necessity and legal compliance. During years of poor harvest, when grape yields were low and wine supplies limited. The temptation to stretch available inventory through careful dilution must have been almost overwhelming. A merchant watching his competitors sell their possibly adulterated wines at profitable prices, while his own honest inventory dwindled, must have faced agonizing decisions about business survival versus legal compliance. The social implications of wine dilution. Punishments extended far beyond the individual. Merchants who were caught and convicted. In medieval society, wine consumption was deeply integrated into social rituals, religious ceremonies, and family celebrations. A merchant condemned to water-only consumption was effectively excluded from normal social participation for an entire year. He couldn't toast at weddings, participate in harvest celebrations, or even share communion wine during religious services. The punishment transformed social ostracism into a formal legal penalty. The law also created interesting dynamics within merchant families, where wives and children might continue to enjoy wine while the household head was restricted to water. This created daily reminders of the consequences of dishonest business practices. As family meals became uncomfortable displays of legal punishment, some families reportedly ate separately during the punishment period, unable to bear the social awkwardness of normal dining arrangements. The seasonal aspects of wine dilution punishment added additional layers of complexity and hardship. A merchant convicted during winter months faced the prospect of consuming only cold water during the harshest weather of the year, when wine provided not just pleasure but actual warmth and comfort. Summer convictions meant missing the festive wine consumption that accompanied harvest celebrations, wedding seasons, and religious festivals. The timing of conviction could determine whether the punishment felt merely inconvenient or genuinely torturous. Some merchants developed elaborate strategies for circumventing detection while still engaging in profitable dilution practices. They experimented with different types of water, seeking sources that would least affect the wine's appearance and taste. Spring water, rainwater, and even specially treated well water were tested for their dilution properties. Some merchants allegedly traded information about water sources the way modern businesses share market intelligence. The law created opportunities for competitive espionage and commercial sabotage that would have impressed modern corporate investigators. Rival merchants might spy on each other's operations, hoping to discover evidence of wine dilution that could be reported to authorities. Some merchants hired trusted servants to infiltrate competitors' businesses, gathering intelligence about production methods and inventory practices. The wine trade became a game of constant surveillance and counter-surveillance, where commercial success depended as much on investigative skills as on product quality. The religious implications of wine dilution laws were particularly complex, given wine's central role in Christian sacraments. Some theological scholars argued that diluting wine intended for communion was not just a commercial crime, but a form of sacrilege, since it involved adulterating a substance that would be transformed into the blood of Christ during Mass. This religious dimension added moral weight to wine purity laws and created additional penalties for merchants who sold diluted wine to churches and monasteries. The international aspects of wine dilution regulations created complications for merchants who conducted business across different regions and kingdoms. Wine that met purity standards in one area might be considered adulterated in another, depending on local testing methods and tolerance levels. Traveling wine merchants had to become experts in regional legal variations, understanding not just the products they sold, but the specific purity requirements of each market they served. The technological innovation driven by wine dilution laws was remarkable in its sophistication and creativity. Merchants invested in better storage methods, improved transportation techniques, and more precise measuring equipment, all designed to maintain wine quality while maximizing profits within legal boundaries. Some regions developed wine certification systems that provided official guarantees of purity, creating early forms of quality branding that added value to properly produced wines. The economic ripple effects of wine dilution enforcement extended throughout medieval society. Honest merchants who maintained quality standards could charge premium prices for their certified pure wines, while those suspected of dilution faced market suspicion and reduced demand. The law created economic incentives for quality maintenance that strengthened the overall reputation of regional wine industries and supported export markets that depended on consumer trust. The psychological rehabilitation aspects of the water punishment were carefully considered by medieval legal theorists. The year-long abstinence from wine was intended not just as punishment, but as character reformation, forcing dishonest merchants to experience the daily consequences of their choices while contemplating the importance of commercial integrity. Some convicted merchants reportedly emerged from their punishment period with renewed commitment to honest business practices and deeper appreciation for the wines they sold. The record-keeping requirements associated with wine dilution cases led to the development of detailed legal documentation that provides fascinating insights into medieval commercial practices. Court records from wine dilution trials reveal information about production methods, market prices, customer relationships, and the daily operations of medieval businesses. These documents represent some of our most detailed sources of information about medieval commercial life and the practical challenges faced by honest merchants trying to compete in competitive markets. As you settle into your final moments of wakefulness tonight, imagine the profound irony experienced by those convicted wine merchants, forced to watch their neighbors enjoy the very product that had been their passion and profession, knowing that a single moment of dishonest judgment had condemned them to a year of tasteless, joyless, liquid sustenance. Their daily glasses of water became constant reminders of the importance of integrity, trust, and the recognition that some shortcuts in life carry costs far greater than any potential profits they might generate. May these memories of medieval legal peculiarities guide you into peaceful dreams, where strange laws and forgotten customs blend into the gentle rhythm of sleep. These stories remind us that human nature, with all its creativity, ambition, and occasional folly, remains remarkably consistent across the centuries. The same impulses that drove medieval people to regulate beard length and test ales with sticky leather pants continue to shape our modern world in ways both obvious and subtle. If you've drifted off during our gentle journey through time, let me know in the comments below how these strange legal tales affected your sleep. Sweet dreams, dear friends, and may your rest be untroubled by Ale Connor's fashion police, or the complex theological implications of Sunday eggs. Until next time, this is your companion in boring history, whispering you softly toward the peaceful realm of dreams. Sleep well.